Hello and welcome to a Theorist vlog. This one is all about this man here, David Hesmondhalgh, and his cultural industries theory. And as a case study, we're going to be using this company here. I don't know if you've heard of them before. Their name is Facebook. But before we talk about Hesmondhalgh and Facebook, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, which won't surprise many of you who know me, and talk about the fact that many of you watching may well be off to university soon or in the next year or two, and you'll probably hear a lot of your parents or people of an older generation say, well, we didn't have Facebook in my day, because social media will become probably a key part of your university experience. It's something that will be utilised, I'm sure, by lecturers and staff, but more importantly by yourselves and your peers to communicate with one another, even if it's not something as antiquated and for old people like Facebook. But despite the fact that Facebook was not available when I was at university, it doesn't stop photographs of my time at university appearing and emerging on that platform. This is a photograph from aforementioned Facebook profile. It's not one that I put up myself, but you can see I've been tagged in it. This is me as an 18-year-old first year student in halls of residence. And the reason I put this up was something quite profound said to me by a friend of mine who I shared halls of residence with, a guy called Frederick from France. Freddie was only in Liverpool for the year. It was a year as part of his sort of sandwich course at university. One of the loveliest and friendliest people I met in my whole 3 years at university. And he said to me one evening, we were discussing, I can't even remember what the conversation was about, but I remember he said, you know how each of us have decorated our rooms in this halls of residence with our own posters, and we've brought in our own books, and we've organised the room in our own way. And he was quite right. You know, you bring part of yourself to a room when all you've got is a single room with a small bed and a minimal in terms of furniture. People have different posters of their favourite bands or artists or films. People will decorate with their own in their own way. People have their own books and affectations and photographs and pictures from home and all these kind of things. And so we were discussing how individualised people were through their room. And then he said, despite all of this, we all have the same curtains. I thought there was something deeply profound in that. And that's the kind of conversation, the deep conversation you can have when you get to university in real life rather than on perhaps social media. But anyway, on to David Hesmondhalgh and the cultural industries theory. All right, this is one of 3 industry theories that we look at on the course. And of course, David Hesmondhalgh is key at considering how the media can be as successful as it is in different ways, and how it manages to sort of maintain audience and perpetuate itself in certain ways. And we're going to look at each of his points one by one. And it should be kind of hopefully self-evident why I've picked Facebook as a case study for this. Certainly one of the, if not the most successful media product of the past 20 years, but of course going through many changes. And at the moment, most recently, the significant aspect of Facebook is the fact that it's changed its name to Meta. Now, you might be wondering why, or you might have heard of this but not be sure why why Facebook will be now referred to as Meta. Or some of you might have heard this idea that it's changed its name to Meta but still see the Facebook logo everywhere you go online. And that's because Meta is now the name of the parent company that owns Facebook, that used to be called Facebook, the company that Mark Zuckerberg started, that you will have maybe seen in that movie, The Social Network. But the overall parent company is now called Meta, which draws our attention to the fact that Facebook as a platform is just one part of this social media conglomerate, this juggernaut that is Meta. So let's tie this straight into the first point that David Hesmondhalgh makes. Okay, let's look at that. The idea that cultural industry companies try to minimize risk and maximize audiences through vertical and horizontal integration through formatting their cultural products, through stars, genres, franchises and stuff like that. Well, I guess let's start with that final part about how they format their products. I guess the most obvious thing is that Facebook has always done what it can to innovate and change. It's always moved with times. It's never stayed still. Facebook has always adapted itself, evolved to make sure it's doing what it can to be the most popular product it can be, which is, I suppose, what Hesmondhalgh would refer to as formatting. But the first point is kind of more interesting to us, as how the company has organised itself through vertical and horizontal integration. For a long time, the absolute daddy of social media platforms, just taking over everything in its wake. The company, as I'm sure you know, owns lots of other platforms that you use. I suppose the most significant of which is Instagram, which is much more popular amongst a younger demographic. Certainly WhatsApp as a communication tool, and of course Messenger, which was the original way you would communicate with people on Facebook. So you can see not only is Facebook interested in this kind of vertical integration in terms of Facebook itself as a platform, Messenger as a way of communicating via Facebook, but it's also horizontally spreading itself out, okay, taking over other platforms that do broadly similar things. Instagram arguably is a kind of version of Facebook where you get to document your life and share images and ideas with people, and WhatsApp is arguably another version of Messenger, primarily a communication tool where you can share communication and conversations with multiple groups. So this is what Hesmondhalgh is talking about, organising itself both vertically and horizontally to be as successful as possible, okay? And I think once you understand the fact that a Meta brand owns all of these things, then you get a sense of just how flooded the market is with Facebook's products. So quite a simple thing to understand first of all. Leads us on to his second point, okay? So once again, what's this second point? The idea that the largest companies or conglomerates now operate across a range of different cultural industries. Right, well, again, Facebook, or Meta, should I say, certainly does that. If we take all of those kind of platforms that we talked about before as being one thing, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, Messenger, we kind of broadly put those into the social media kind of box, if you like, we can see that Meta is also heavily involved in broadening its horizons to other types of companies, albeit all digital and online ones. In fact, it's worth taking a little bit of research onto the Wikipedia page for the list of mergers and acquisitions by Meta platforms. Okay, constantly updated. It makes for some really interesting reading. Okay, you get a sense of just how much money has been poured into this as a platform. You can see there, I've highlighted some of the kind of the bigger purchases made by Facebook over the years. The most significant one, of course, is WhatsApp, that was purchased for $19 billion, okay, in 2014. I think the surprising one in terms of how little it cost was the purchase of Instagram for just $1 billion in 2012. That seems like an absolute bargain considering how much people use it these days. There's one in the middle there that I've included, which was the second most expensive purchase, Oculus, which was purchased for $2 billion. Now, some of you will definitely know what this is, particularly those of you who are gamers, okay? Oculus is the leading, I suppose, VR, virtual reality, hardware and software producer in the world at the moment, and those of you who know more about VR than I do, you can correct me on that. For those of you who aren't sure what I'm talking about, VR is basically where you put on a headset, you use devices to immerse yourself in an online world, and hopefully don't look as silly as you can. Okay, but Facebook, or Meta, should I say, has purchased huge amounts of these companies and is really seriously interested in diversifying into that kind of VR world. So again, this is a great example of a company doing what it can to spread out, not just within its own specialism, social networks, but also into different cultural industries. And the world of gaming and virtual reality would definitely be seen as a different cultural industry. I'm going to take a quick sidestep for a minute and talk about this woman. Her name is Frances Haugen, and she worked for Facebook for years and has become what's now known as a whistleblower. Because the other thing to coincide, shall we say, with Facebook's relaunch as Meta was a number of stories that came out in Associated Press. It was a huge story where the press joined up to basically dish the dirt on Facebook based on a lot of the things that this woman who worked for them for many years in a high position said was going on. Now, these are now known as the Facebook papers. You can read about them in lots of different online media and newspapers as well. I will link in below to some of the more interesting stories. But suffice to say, Frances Haugen detailed how Facebook wasn't perhaps the most ethical company in the world. In fact, she would go far as saying that actually some of its practices were unethical. Now, a lot of this was to do with perhaps the kind of, if you like, the attention politics of Facebook, and how perhaps it wasn't overly concerned with people's addictions, with perhaps it wasn't doing what it could to deal with racism and bigotry and sexism online, all the things that social networks are often accused of. But she also revealed, and the papers and the research revealed, that actually this idea we have that social media is much better at perpetuating negative, nasty stories than it is positive stories, it turns out to be true. That stories that have got angry faces or negative reactions actually get pushed further up the algorithm than those with smiley faces and positive reactions, confirming that kind of thought, that worst thought we all had, that actually social media prioritizes the bad over the good. The other thing, of course, that came out in the most recent revelations was that actually the reason why bigotry, racism, sexism was being dealt with so badly, particularly in countries that weren't America or the UK, was that actually the translation of Facebook into other languages across the rest of the world, but primarily the developing world, was pretty bad. The amount of money pumped into kind of anti-bigotry, anti-racism, anti-sexism, if you like, nets, safeguarding practices was huge in the Western world, but very, very small in the rest of the world. So just taking a little bit of a sidestep, if we're going to talk about Meta and Facebook as this kind of global industry, which is the sort of thing that Hesmondhalgh is interested in, we also have to think about representations, because Facebook is the number one self-representation platform, arguably the number one representation of the rest of the world platform that's out there. So we have to take for a moment to consider, what would people like Stuart Hall, what would people like Bell Hooks say about Facebook? Ultimately, if it's failing its global audience, if it's failing those outside of a Western hemisphere, then ultimately could we class Facebook as institutionally racist? Could we say that Facebook is reinforcing a hegemony, a patriarchy, if you like, the sort of thing that Bell Hooks talks about as a platform which is reinforcing the if you like, the undermining or the subjugation of those who already struggle to find a voice in society? Would Stuart Hall say that actually the constructed representations on Facebook reinforce negative stereotypes, and that those stereotypes represent a kind of balance of an inequality in power balances and stuff like that? So it might be of a sidestep, and it's not necessarily to do with industries, maybe more to do with representations, but we have to consider that Facebook as an industry is in the business of representation. So considering these revelations made by Frances Haugen and thinking about what Hall and Hooks both say about power and representations, I think it's worth considering these and thinking about those who have been left behind by Facebook rather than those who are being served. Okay, let's go back to what Facebook is doing in the future and thinking about things like Oculus Rift and how this virtual reality world links to what Hesmondhalgh is saying. Because Hesmondhalgh doesn't talk about just this idea that media platforms are expanding all the time. He also name checks the internet directly in his third and final point that we look at on the course, and that's to do with whether or not the internet's potential is being fully realised. Hesmondhalgh says that the radical potential of the internet is somewhat contained by its partial incorporation into a large profit-orientated set of cultural industries. Wow, okay. Now, we can maybe imagine this when it comes to other cultural industries. Maybe, for example, the film industry. Does it really exploit the internet to its full extent in its marketing? Some films really use the internet in an innovative and interesting way. Most films will have perhaps a website and a few social media platforms. TV. Sometimes TV can be seen as a medium which embraces the internet, which actually incorporates lots of different ideas of online and interactive media. Other times we can say that the TV's presence online is perhaps as minimal as it can be. When we come to social media, we might be safe in assuming that perhaps the social media platforms do a little bit more because, after all, they are immersed and embedded in the internet. And particularly when we look at the idea of virtual reality, surely that is pushing the internet to its absolute potential. And this is where we get to this concept of the Metaverse. Some of you may have heard of it. It's something that Mark Zuckerberg was talking about quite a lot when the rebranding of Meta happened. He wants us all to be incorporated in something that is known or will be known as the Metaverse. And so the question is, what is the Metaverse? I think we all have our different pictures and ideas of this. The idea that perhaps somehow we might be incorporated into some kind of matrix as if we are subsumed and turning into a digital fiction. But at the end of the day, the most important thing for us to consider is how will this metaverse have an impact on our lives. Zuckerberg talks about it as being somewhere where we can not just go to play games, but somewhere where every aspect of our normal lives can be consumed by an online immersive virtual reality presence. Okay, there's a great video that the BBC did a little investigation into it. It's only short. I'll link to that below as well. And so for Zuckerberg, he wants to fully take I suppose advantage of this radical potential that the internet has. So this is a great opportunity for us to consider what other theorists might say as well. And I guess the most obvious one when we're talking about audiences and the internet is, of course, Clay Shirky and his end of audience theory. And I found this quotation from Shirky. I wasn't aware that he'd said it before I was looking around. A revolution doesn't happen when society adopts new tools. It happens when society adopts new behaviours. And so whilst Zuckerberg might be keen for us to embrace the new tools, embrace the new possibilities and software and hardware that's available to us, someone like Shirky would say, well, actually, it's not necessarily about what's available to us in terms of the practical, in terms of the technical, but it's actually more about our own behaviours and whether we're going to use this. We saw Google Glass, an online feature which allowed you to look through spectacles to see a virtual world, basically crash and burn about 6 or 7 years ago. I know Zuckerberg and Meta are hoping to introduce something similar through Facebook. Whether that takes off or not will remain to be seen. But I really like this quotation from Shirky. It reminds us that really the changes, the true power happens when the audience start using things. But it also makes me think of whether or not, despite Zuckerberg's insistence that there is a radical potential being fulfilled by the internet through his online practices, whether or not Facebook really is that radical, whether actually something that's owned by a huge corporation can ever really be that radical. And this takes me back to what Freddie said in our halls of residence, the fact that it reminds me, whenever I think of Facebook, it reminds me of Freddie and that observation he made about our halls of residence. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who we are, okay, or what we're doing, we all have to operate within the confines of whatever Zuckerberg allows us to. Everybody's Facebook profile really is exactly the same, with just a few different photos here, a few different check-ins there, a few different comments there, okay? Despite the seemingly endless possibilities to customize and make Facebook our own, we've all got the same curtains. And I think the same is going to be said for the metaverse as well. I think part of us would like to believe that the metaverse is going to be this incredible, diverse place where we can all be these impossibly sexy avatars, realizing our true selves, maybe being a truer version of ourselves in an online world. And maybe one day that will be true. But for now, I think the truth is much more likely to be similar to what we've seen so far. That actually we'll be working from home, but maybe in an online environment where we haven't got any legs. We're sat round a table that looks a bit like the one we have at work. Dave from marketing has found an avatar that makes him look a little bit more like Simon Cowell, which is distracting. And Sue from accounts has found an avatar that looks nothing like her, but for some reason has found exactly the same dress that she wears every day. And so the limitations of an online world become revealed to us because they are being controlled by a corporate entity. So maybe Hesmondhalgh was right all along. You know, the radical potential of the internet is still confined for another day. Anyway, let me know what you think. There was a lot to unpack there and a lot discussed because Meta is a huge company. Hesmondhalgh has got some really interesting things to say, and I think it's an interesting case study. But do explore, do some research, and tell me what you think. Yeah, thanks for watching.